So I just want to welcome everyone. And then before we get started, I'm just going to give a quick little intro for you. I know you've spoken at a couple of our past events, so it's always a pleasure to have you back. So just a little quick background. Dr. David is the president and CEO of Weiss International Limited, which is a Toronto-based firm specializing in innovation, leadership, and HR consulting for Fortune 500, social enterprises, and public sector organizations. David and his team of organizational consultants generate business, organizational, and people solutions for executive and boards globally. David has consulted on more than 1,000 businesses and organizational projects on 5 continents, including Canada, the USA, England, Holland, France, Hungary, Israel, Italy, Russia, China, Malaysia, Uganda, South Africa, and Chile. He also has delivered over 220 conferences and presentations, presented at over 150 university executive developments and programs, and wrote over 60 journal articles. So we're honored to have you here. And if you'd like, you can take it away and get started.
Sounds great. Just to get us going, I put this in the general site, but I'll also put this here as well. So in our chat box, just a bit of information you might want to have. So this is an article about change that I published in the past, and also some reference to the site that has a whole bunch of other articles if you want to read more, about 10 articles on HR that I've published in the past, all free downloads, so enjoy them and you can go to them and have a good time. So today I want to talk about why people resist change. It's a topic that, given COVID, given the dramatic changes that are going on, we're finding that many people have embraced the change, which is really exciting to see. I hear a lot of resiliency, certainly in the early stages, but we're finding a number of challenges emerging, certainly mental health challenges emerging, and also overall, even unrelated to COVID, resistance to change seems to be somewhat constant. So I want to enhance your appreciation of what it is that creates this resistance to change and how we might actually address it. So I'm going to just bring this up on the screen. It's a few slides that I'll be sharing with you. So why people resist change is the theme of today, and let's talk about it. So here we go. And let me just bring this up. I'm trying to move to there we are. I think I do it down there. Is that how you do it? Okay. So the question is why people resist change, and let me, there we go. So what we found is that people do resist change, and we find that there are actually 4 kinds of responses that we are going to see when you launch a major change, as well as, there are different kinds of resistances. So one of the objectives for this session is to ensure that you not only respond to resistance to change by assuming all resistance is alike. Not all resistances are alike, and you need to respond differently based upon what is the nature of that resistance that the individual is exhibiting. So a lot of it is coming from my two recent books that I published, the one on leadership-driven HR and innovative intelligence. And by all means, that article and that chapter and that link to my website, you're invited to download a whole bunch of articles that are related to these books for your interest. This is what it looks like on the site, and this is the article that I sent to you, Change Management from Concept to End Results. So let's think about it as a roadmap for a second. And when we think about the roadmap, obviously, if you're dealing with change, you start with the present reality, and you think about, what is that end state that I'm striving for in terms of what it would look like when the change is implemented and when things are working well. And what we find is that people respond to change in different ways. I'm going to explore that with you as potentially champions and helpers and bystanders and resistors. And then we'll take a look at this section here, which really gets to the heart of what we're discussing, which is why people resist change and how do we make sure that we understand the nature of the resistance to respond appropriately. And then, of course, you have to develop your action plan. So let's get into it. The questions for the session, again, why do some people resist change? The 4 kinds of resistances. Let's look at that first one, why do people resist change? Bill Gates had a great line, very popular. People overestimate the amount of change in 2 years, and they underestimate the amount of change in 10 years. What seems to happen is people catastrophize. They immediately respond by having a sense of it's unfamiliar, it's an undesirable environment, change is destabilizing, frustrating, and confusing, and as a result, what ends up happening is that people respond with anxiety. So change, by nature of it, destabilizes. And by nature of it, change ultimately induces anxiety. So we're going to find that the immediate reaction is going to be some level of, I don't really want to do this. And sometimes it goes deeper and the resistance becomes embedded in the response of the individual. Some individuals are stronger at being resilient to change. They have the ability to persevere and adapt when things go awry. So that is, in fact, something which you may want to focus on. To how do people understand their extent of resiliency, their ability to bounce back and be agile in the face of change? Because that capability allows individuals to respond more effectively in general. But let's take a look at it. People often, when they see change, they personalize or they blame, they jump to conclusions, they overgeneralize, they discount the positive a lot of times, they go into the shoulds and musts, and they feel that basically they're in a position of victim and resistance really emerges. Why people resist change? Let's now consider what are the 4 kinds of responses to change that we want to likely experience. So this is a fun one over here. What I'd ask you to do, the people in this session, is try to read this. Can everybody read this? So this is a research study that found that words are legible if you read it and have the first and the last letter in the right place. People somehow can still read this gibberish and make sense of it. So give it a try. I know I can't hear you, but read it through. Now I know some people might get on the 5th line. The rest can be a total mess. You know, that sometimes is a little more challenging because there's more options. But I would bet that by and large, most of you are pretty good at doing that. So perfection is going to be the enemy of good in this world of handling resistance. Do good work. Try to advance this and be iterative in the way that it unfolds, because you're going to learn more about the nature of resistance as you try things and engage people in the process. So remember our leadership roadmap. I want to focus now on the different kinds of responses that we have. And I'm going to describe to you these 4: champions, helpers, bystanders, and resistors. And what I'd like to do is go to the back of the room for this. And I closed my screen on purpose. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to explain this to you in a little bit more detail of what I mean. So when you launch a change, what typically happens, and now you're in the back of my room, what typically happens is that people tend to respond in 4 different ways. So hi, everybody. Good to see you again. And the 4 different ways tend to be that they may be a champion, which means that they will actually be advocates for the change. They'll actually speak out on behalf of the change and be spokespeople for it. Now, interestingly enough, what we find is that there's a kind of an expected percentage of people that will likely be champions in most situations. So let's say 20 people are going through a change, for argument's sake. We will typically find about 10% of the people will be champions for the change. Okay, we got 2 people who are like that. So with the champions, I want you to encourage the leaders, if you're encouraging leaders, or you yourself, if you're leading the change, to embrace them as an equal. There's a wonderful TED Talk on the shirtless dancer, and it's used a lot to teach the power of the first follower. When you get a first follower, it becomes a very, very strong opportunity to leverage that relationship that the peer has with others in order to influence others to come along. So that 10% is a very powerful 10%. Interestingly enough, the resistors are about 10% as well. Now, when that 10%, that means we got another 2 people on this side. Now, please be aware that resistors do not call themselves resistors. Resistors actually call themselves champions for the other side. They don't see themselves in relationship to you. They actually see themselves in relationship to themselves. And what they see for themselves is that, in fact, they are championing something that's different than what you believe. Now, you experience them as resistors. So we have about 20% of the people taken care of over here. Let me slide back over here again. And when we think about it, there's 80% left. So think about it for a second. Where are the 80% mostly? Are they in the bystanders group? Or are they in the helpers group? Think for a second. Now, actually, what we find is that 60% of the respondents are typically in the bystander group and 20% are helpers. The helpers mean they'll support you, but they're not going to go public with it. The bystanders are your non-committed vote. We see that in political environments when people go through elections. They always go for the non-committed. That's what you typically will find. So most people, when they deal with change, the first thing they like to do, because these people are noisy, is they go after the resistors because they're vocal and they worry about them and they're scared. But the reality is, the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure that this quiet group over here is actually given attention. Because if you give attention to this particular group, then you can move them over towards being helpers and champions. And what you need to launch a good change and to build momentum, to build a tipping point where people, because they're participating, will influence others to participate and reduce resistance, what you need is usually about 55% helpers and champions in both these groups. So I've got to move about 25% of these people over to becoming the helpers and maybe even champions. So don't forget the quiet bystanders. Usually you assume, they're quiet, they're probably helpers. A little hard to tell the difference between a bystander and a helper because they both don't necessarily talk up, but don't assume if they're quiet, they're just going to go along with you. It could very well be that they will not. And in fact, this battleground over here is what they are going for as well. So the resistors want to increase their mass. And what they do is they go to the bystanders to try to convince them to join their club. So these 60% are being canvassed, are being influenced, are being talked to. But don't believe these resistors when they say, well, you know what, I'm speaking up for many, many people. The answer is they're probably trying to influence many people, but that's not, in fact, necessarily true that they're representing them. So now let's assume that we've got this thing, you've done the right thing, you've gone for the bystanders. By virtue of moving 25%, you're probably going to start getting some critical mass where the movement will be that individuals will start reducing their resistance just because, you know, the population is moving in that direction. But still, you need to really pay attention to this group as well. So I want to go back to the desk and discuss with you what are these resistors like, and let's look at 4 different kinds of resistors that make up this 10%, and what do you do for each one of them because they are different the way you might respond. So I'm going to close my viewing for a second and come back to the table to show you what I'm talking about. So now we're going to be thinking about who are those 4 resistors, that 4 types of resistors that I want to explore with you. And the 4 types of resistors that I'd like you to consider are as follows. I'm back here now, and you can see in the back, so this is not a virtual background. That's where we were. So the 4 types of resistors are as follows, and let me, again, go back to the screen share for the purposes of this so we can talk about it. And it looks like this. So the champions, remember we said they understand the compelling need for the change, they share your vision, and that bottom part, they'll influence others. Helpers, they'll go with you, but ultimately they will, they'll be quiet. Bystanders, that's the ground where you can really influence if they understand why, if they understand what, if they understand how, if you understand what's their worries or if they have any that are making them sit on the fence, you can probably move them pretty quickly. But it's these resistors that I'm a little bit concerned about. So can we diagnose them and really deal with our question today, which was, how do you actually help people who are resisting and diagnosing it properly? So if you think about it, if you're going through a change right now, first identify humans, like who are the people who are your champions and who are your resistors. You need to talk to the bystanders, see which ones are really bystanders, which ones are helpers, and then what you need to do is, engage those bystanders. That's stage one. But when we think about this, we need to then say the third question here, which is how can you analyze the 4 types of resistance to change and how to respond in each situation? So now what we're doing is we're looking at this box on the bottom right. Remember, we had champions, helpers, bystanders, and resistors. And we're going to explore these 4 in our roadmap that ultimately I'm asking you to travel on to answer the question why people resist change. So what I'm going to argue is that there are 4 types of change, 4 types of resistance to change. The first one is what I call principled. Now, what this means is that this is a person who is responding to the change you are contemplating. Remember, championing for the other side. They're responding to your change by saying cognitively, I disagree. I don't agree with maybe the compelling reason why you believe a change is needed. So maybe we should stay the same. I don't agree with maybe that. I agree maybe that we have a reason to change, but I don't agree with what you chose to do or how you chose to do it. I think that you're doing the wrong thing. That group is an incredibly important group to understand because they're logical. And by virtue of that logical argument, there may be an opportunity for you to clarify certain issues. And if they are committed and vocal about what the change is, and they disagree, if they realize that maybe there is some merit to why and your what and your how, they all of a sudden could become equally vocal as champions. Remember, they are naturally champions. They champion against you. They can flip all the way to the other side to be champions on behalf of the change. And that's actually incredibly useful. So recognize when it's an emotional variable that is actually affecting their resistance or when it's actually an analytical variable that is affecting the resistance. And also you may find with the principle that maybe they have some correctness to what they're saying. Maybe they see something that's problematic in the change that you can leverage and use as a methodology to enhance the quality of the change you're contemplating. So possibly leverage what they're saying. And so it's listening. Let me ask you, what is the issue you're seeing? What is the concern? Let me understand it. Let me share with you our logic. That's really interesting, that point. Let's watch for that. I need you on my team. They have a little bit of a greater opportunity to influence, and they will influence a lot of bystanders if, in fact, they flip over to the champion side. Now, that second group, that cultural group, is a little different. So the cultural resistor is someone who could very well believe that why you're doing that change makes a lot of sense. What you chose to do is actually a good solution to what you're going to do to resolve that why, and it could be a good solution to how you want to do it. All that could work really well. However, when it's cultural, I don't trust you. You have a track record of never implementing it. I don't trust the individual that they're telling me the truth. And therefore, I don't believe you or I don't believe the organization. Even though I might accept the change, I don't believe in you or the organization to actually pull this off or to do this in the best interest of what you're trying to do. Now, in that situation, you've got to look for trusted individuals who would be willing to speak on behalf of the change. So it may be you, it may be someone else. You may need to bring in other people who'll talk about this and say, I know you might have thought that in the past we did things and it didn't work, but this one we really need to do. It's going to happen. I'm committed to it. We have to work on building that trust. And remember, trust takes forever to build, but a second to destroy. And mistrust takes forever to destroy and a second to build. It's just going to merge immediately. So be very thoughtful about how you can work those who are resisting because of cultural variables. The third category is called personal. And what personal really means is that they may be accepting, I know why you're doing it, They accept the principle. I know what you're doing and how you're doing it. All that's fine. I get it. I even believe culturally you're going to pull it off. I believe you can do it. I think you will be successful. However, it's hurting me individually. That's the WIFM, the WIFM. What's in it for me? And they're asking the question that this is really damaging. So it's extremely important, because people exaggerate in their mind when you speak to these people, to ask them the question, basically, what's on your mind? Tell me more about it. Let me understand what you're worried about. And let me see if I can help you, so that what's you're worried about will be less of a worry for you. It becomes a coaching role, a listening role, where you really need to understand it. It is frequent that what they do is they assume that there are elements to the change that are more damaging to themselves than the reality will actually dictate. That's why the good change leader not only identifies what will change, but also identifies what will not change. And that will reduce some of the resistance, because you would have communicated it by saying, we're not going into that space, so don't worry about it. But it is possible that it is going to be damaging to someone. It may, in fact, be good overall for the organization, but not good for certain individuals. And so you need to talk to them. You need to discuss what is the ways that we can mitigate this damage, if you choose to do that, and understand that and work with them. These folks it's much tougher to actually get past the resistance, but don't assume that everyone who's resisting is in this category, because most people assume that it's all about what's in it for me, and they're going to miss out on the opportunity to influence the principled resistor, or influence the one who has cultural resistance, where it's okay for them, but they don't believe you can pull it off. Now, the fourth category is a very interesting one. The fourth category is driven off of the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, where what ended up happening was, in this fourth category, you ended up finding immediate short-term kinds of resistance. But let's just review. Remember this chart. The first one, which we called principled, really were those first two items on the top. So this would be, they don't agree with your why, the what, or the how. The next one down here, this was more the cultural. I don't trust you. I don't believe in the organization, and that you can actually pull that off. The third one down here would be the personal, and that's the change may actually cause me personally damage, even though they accept that it might be good for the organization. And overall, they're likely to be resistant. The fourth category is a little tricky, because in reality, it looks just like all the other resistances. And all these resistances kind of look alike. That's why I want you to ask questions to diagnose it, to properly respond to it. But this one is called early stage resistance. And what that means is the immediate reaction that we find from most people is just like we said earlier. Remember, because being in unfamiliar and undesirable environments can be destabilizing, frustrating, and confusing. The short-term reaction, if they're not that resilient, is that they will say, I'd rather say no than say yes. So there's a variable in the immediate launch of a change where you're going to get a lot more than 10% that might be resistant. But that is a short-term, early stage resistance that you've got to do a lot of listening, pay attention to them, but rather rapidly, they'll either move to the bystander or the helper position, because it's more of a knee-jerk shock reaction that they're having to that particular change. It's very much like the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross model, where she dealt with in her book on death and dying. People go through stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. It could take a long time in that situation, but ultimately, and when you go through change, it could be pretty rapid. So tell leaders who are going through change, or if you're leading the change, that don't get anxious, don't personalize it. When early on, when you launch the change, you get people who are going to say that they're really upset about it. Because just stay with them, do a lot of listening, a lot of coaching, and what will happen is people will ultimately travel with you and come out of it, because time becomes the ally. And that's something that it becomes really powerful. So think about the principled, think about the cultural, think about the personal, and think about the early stage. The earliest possible time try to engage people with the change. Remember the principle, people don't mind change, they mind being changed. You will reduce the resistance if they feel they've got the fingerprints on the change, if they are influencing the change, and then ultimately you'll find that people will travel with you much further. So overall, remember, clearly identify your present and your future reality. Know that there are a variety of different responses to change, and that champions and resistors are basically the same. They're champions, one's for you and one's for the other side. And diagnose the difference between the helpers and bystanders and focus in on those bystanders, because if you get critical mass, it'll move them to the other side. But then when we think about those resistors, remember, not all resistance is alike. And don't immediately go to their resisting because it's personal, because it could be principled, it could be, in fact, cultural, and it could be early stage, which time will be a great healer if you're a good listener in that process. And then you build your action plan. And the action plan to deal with this resistance is, number one, to understand it more thoroughly, and number two is to engage as much as possible so that people are part of the change rather than being changed. So find that roadmap, travel on it, go on it through the process for yourself, and also if you're helping others through the process, this would be something that is very effective. So why do people resist change? We said it already. People, it's natural. People, you could change a no to a yes a lot easier than changing a yes to a no. The 4 kinds of responses: champion, helper, bystander, and resistor. And remember that there's 4 types of resistance: the principled, and we also have the cultural, the personal, and then that early stage resistance. These kinds of sessions, for example, when I do them, they typically are about a half-day virtual session, and that roadmap that we took a look at is the focus of the session. So the whole session is about how do they complete this roadmap for a real change that they are working on, and ultimately by the end of it, they've got a roadmap. So they built their plan for a change that they are contemplating with the assumption that they can use the roadmap again for the next time that they're facing a change. And this becomes an asset for them as they proceed. So please take a look at that article. It'll give you some idea of the full process of change, and that would be delightful. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I'd welcome questions at this point. So I'm going to stop sharing this and open it up to any questions from anybody in the group. So what kinds of thoughts or questions come to mind? And you can ask them or put them into the chat box, and I'd be delighted to explore that with you. What kinds of questions come to mind? I had one question in one group that I was teaching where someone said, what about the disruptor? The one who's resistant and fights you and causes problems. Have any of you faced that one where it's not just principled or cultural, but actually they become a serious challenge? And that's where, you really need to discuss with the individual, what is going on there, and are they able to stay with this particular situation, or do we have to find other ways of utilizing their talents, perhaps in this organization, if that is possible. But diagnose it, and don't assume that all resistance is alike, because it's really easy to make that mistake, and you'll miss out on opportunities to influence people and hopefully bring them along so that they be able to be part of the change rather than being resistance of the change. So I want to thank you. We don't have any questions from the group, but once again, you could check out my website at weissinternational.ca, and you can reach me at david.weiss@weissinternational.ca. If you'd like to ask any additional questions, I'm delighted to chat with you. So I'm just going to send both those in the chat box for you to take a look at that. So thank you so much for listening, everybody. Have a great conference. Over to you, Sarah.
All right. Thank you, David. We always, of course, we know change is very hard. We've definitely experienced that over the past year. I think your session, though, really helped us out, gave us a better understanding, shows you a way to go about change and how to succeed and do better. So it was always a pleasure having you. And if anyone has any other questions, thank you, David. You gave us all your information to contact you, and we're all good.
So just one final thing. I'm going to go to the networking room now. So
All right.
if there is anybody for the next 10 minutes or so, and if there's anybody who wants to chat further, join me in the networking room and we'll have a one-on-one chat. All the best to you. Thank you, everybody.
All
Stay
right.
safe.
Thank you. Great
All the
having
best.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.